any more than a midware knows what the color green is in terms of human experience. A midware has a sensory mechanism. Let's talk about a secondary because he's physical. He's got a sensory mechanism, and I'm sure that he can pick up light, analyze its wavelength, and correctly name the color green based on his analysis of the wavelength of visual light. So he can talk to a human being about something green, but no midware has ever seen the color green because they don't have eyes. And a midware would perceive a continuous belt of radiation going right down into the infrared and right on up into the ultraviolet, where we suddenly stop seeing. Although we can feel sunburn the next day and we can sense heat through other parts of our sensory mechanism. We can prove it's there, but not with our eyes.
Now, if you've answered questions for me and all,
I haven't answered any questions. I've just been describing some things. If I could answer them, I'd understand the reality.
You began when she turned on the machine the second time with God's will, and I stopped you to ask my question. Thank you, sir, but now will you go on with God's will?
Could you ask that question for you on God's will? Because I have a feeling that you're going to talk a long time about it.
What's your question, woman?
Well, I got stopped the other day, Bill, on page 48, beginning with the fourth paragraph. First that's a little harsh. She just told me, that didn't explain it, so I understood it.
48.
That's the first time I've known a bird not explaining to you, I understand.
Where are you, Wilma? Page 48, where?
Beginning of the fourth paragraph, the divine omnipotence
Mm-hmm.
is perfectly coordinated with the other attributes of the personality of God. Now this is where I get stopped. The power of God is ordinarily only limited in its universe spiritual manifestation by three conditions or situations.
All they're saying there, Wilma, is that God is consistent. And that God being a consistent being with no civil war going on inside of himself, being a perfectly unified being, isn't going to do anything ungodlike. So from our standpoint, we could say that God has certain limitations. He cannot do an ungodlike act.
Well, Bill,
Which is another way of saying that God is a consistent being.
over here, though, the early part of this paper, of this section of the paper, we are speaking of power, not of, we're speaking of energy.
Yeah.
Now, this is continuation, see?
Yes.
The power of God. Does it mean the energy of God
No.
is ordinarily
No. Power is used
That's
in the
what-
sense of sovereignty, too.
here?
Yes.
In this sense,
In the
right
larger
here, you
sense.
think it's sovereignty.
Yes, I do.
Well, then I can understand.
Elsewhere in the paper we were referring to below, they spoke about omnipotence and compossibility, where they said when God makes a circle, inherent in that act is the determination of the circularity of all circles. Yeah. And when God makes a square, inherent in the conception of the first square is the squareness of all squares. Hence, it becomes impossible for God to make square circles or to perform acts of evil which are inherently good. And again, all they're saying is God is a consistent being. That's the simplest way of putting it. And a consistent being is incapable of inconsistencies, in contrast to a human being who can be wise on one occasion and a damn fool on another occasion, as I'm sure we all have experienced one time or another in our lives. Human Human beings are not consistent beings. We're emotional beings. We fatuously call ourselves Homo sapiens, man the wise. A more accurate name would be Homo emotionalensis, man the emotional.
That's true. We're all very inconsistent. Some more consistent than others, some more inconsistent than others.
This is true. Much of our life is lived on an emotional level. We have flashes of logic and occasional sparks of wisdom. But a heck of a lot of it's emotional. Which is to say, most of the time we're being high-class mammals. And now and then we become human. I think that's one of the finest things about economics. The profit and loss sheet forces man to try to be logical. You've got some crazy idea, and the first thing you know, your bank balance is getting kind of skimpy. Well, you're apt to re-examine the idea. And then later on, if you change your ways and your bank balance fattens up, you say, well, you gave up your brainchild. It didn't work. God is consistent. To me, that's all this says, Wilma. He cannot be a loving and a hating God at the same time. You see, the early God of the Old Testament is an inconsistent deity.
What do you find you supposed to put the word ordinarily in there, though? When would it be other than ordinarily?
Where do you see this? Oh.
Second line.
I don't know. Because I don't think they can write in 6 short lines of print the blueprint for how God administers power. So they put in a slight qualifier there. In other words, this is dependable. But we haven't exhausted the truth in the matter. It's like God the ultimate is omnipresent. But if you want to really split hairs, there is an end to his potential presence. Hence, he's not omnipresent. But this area is so very large, so inconceivably large, that the word applies. At least it applies as far as the super-universe over Vantan is concerned. He's omnipresent. And the other super-universe is in the next outer space level. And that's quite large enough for me.
We were only concerned with this planet.
Doesn't it kick the slats out of your imagination? You know, the world, heaven, and hell, and if you go to a different church, then you've got purgatory and limbo. And that's about it, isn't it? I want to talk about God's will. Can anybody think up a question? This is a rough one.
We sure can.
Well, let's
What is it?
first talk about it on the finite level.
You think I can talk about it beyond that?
I don't want him to start talking about it on the abstract level, but if he does, I won't leave.
I want to use a lot of simple little comparisons. Because we're dealing with truth here, not fact. And you can live truth, but when you talk about it, you can suggest more than you can define. To me, God's will is like a string which you give to a child in the hope that he will display creativity in the choice of the bubbles that he strings on this string to make a necklace in line with his desires. It is an ordering of the baubles of human experience. God's will is not the necklace. God's will is the string, and it is for man to create this necklace out of the circumstances of life. It is an ordering and a simplifying of what otherwise would be a double handful of beads. I don't think God cares what color we choose. I don't think God cares what size of bead we choose. I think God is concerned that we make as beautiful a necklace as lies within our powers of creativity. I think God's will is a liberation of man, not a limitation of man. I think God's will is an opportunity and not a restriction on man. I don't think God is so concerned with what enters the human mouth as what comes out of the human mouth. I don't think God's will is concerned with formulas or procedures. I don't think God's will is concerned with the river banks of human thinking and institutions as with the river that flows between these ever-changing banks. You got to have the banks, or there's no river. And I think God recognizes this. And the only thing I think he's concerned about is if the river gets dammed up. But as to where these banks are, and the oxbow lakes that get cut off and left behind, as long as the river keeps flowing, that's God's will. God's will is a living thing which provides the trunk out of which many branches can grow and which can bear many different kinds of fruit. God's will is to me like the living germplasm of the human race, which provides for individual expressions in individual lives, which can be uniquely different from each other. I don't think God's will is the same for each man. I think Jesus beautifully suggested this when he talked to the 12 after the crucifixion up along the shores of Galilee. He went out with the apostles, the 10 of them were there, 2 by 2. And to each pair he asked a different question. He spoke for God when he queried these men. And I'm very intrigued that he asked different questions. Do you serve me? Do you love me? Do you trust me? Do you obey me?
And he gave each one of them a different instruction how to live the remainder of their lives.
God's will is that one be a good shepherd and another be a good fisherman. God's will is a challenge to man. There's an old boy up in Chicago teaching Sunday school in a Lutheran church, and he's working away at part 4. And he's glimpsed this truth. How, I don't know. But in 2 long conversations we had, 3, he is very concerned. He said, God is challenging men, and men do not know this. God's will is that man continue to grow As I study the universe, it seems to me that God's will puts a premium on uniqueness. And I do not see that he expresses his will in the creation of uniformity on the level of personality. Ah, yes, on the physical level, there's uniformity, but not on the personality level. The billion worlds in Havona are each uniquely different. When he expressed his will directly in an act of fiat creation, he put a premium on uniqueness, not divergence, but uniqueness, not eccentricity, but uniqueness. Let's turn it off for a minute, shall we?
Seraphim and cherubim get through flapping their wings and get the thing turned on.
Recording angels are all seraphim.
Is that it?
Right. They'll resent it if you call them cherubim.
She would?
Yeah?
She's very cherubic at times.
Is it on? What's your question, George?
Now, uniqueness and a personal destiny, as it were, may not be the right word, but a personal pattern to follow for this. Getting down to this, the Lord's Prayer says, "Thy will be done." We're personalizing ourselves in that type of prayer. Of course, we are praying, as I understand, not directly to God in his entirety. I mean, ultimate, or you know more about the level than I do. Which one?
Don't worry, just pray.
Yes.
They got a good post office up there.
Mostly it's through Jesus,
Yeah.
but we say, "Thy will be done." And then here it says, "It is my will that thy will be done."
In one place.
Take me, for instance, then. Take Wilma, I don't care. She's nice to look.
I like Wilma's more attractive than you are, George. If I have my druthers.
All right, take Wilma. Wilma wants to
Is this a bona fide offer?
Yeah,
I'm for it.
Sure. Sure, go ahead.
You know, 100 years from now, they'll never believe we get it this way.
Wilma wants to know. She wants to follow in her life God's will. Right now, she's doing thus and so. Maybe she should be doing thus and so. In a sense, it might be God's will that she should be moved over just a half an inch farther this way and be doing something else. This is a
What you're saying,
proposition.
what you're saying, George, is what is God's will to you, to Wilma?
Yes, this is
To
a
me.
presentation of a premise that there is a will for each person. How do we find that will in our own experience? What is the means of searching, or so on?
Yes.
I'm maybe talking from way down at the bottom of the scale here. I don't know. Y'all may know how to do that. What this is all about, but
No.
Bill, I would like to say something before you start answering that question, because I brought this up myself about 2-3 times about the difference in the prayer, "Thy will be done," and the quotation out of the Blue Book, "It is my will that thy will be done." To me, this is the difference. In the Lord's Prayer, which is repeated in all the churches, "Thy will be done," it indicates to me that I'll hold on to my will, Lord, but it's all right with me. You go ahead and do it. Your will be done. But when you say to the Lord, "It is my will that thy will be done," there's a difference there. I I am willing. I am turning over my will. I am agreeing. I am not still holding on to my will, but you go ahead, Lord, do what you please. I am submitting that it is my will that the Lord puts down. I'm getting a change. Do you see what I mean?
Mm-hmm. And as it's often put, not my will, but yours be done.
Yes. Not my will, not my will, but thy will be done. I'll hold on to my will, but you go ahead and do whatever's your will, God. But when you say it is my will, thy will be done, then you are submitting your will to whatever the Lord does.
When I use the symbol of the string and the beads, and I've never been able to think of a simpler symbol. The point I tried to make was God is concerned with principle, not with procedure. I don't think procedures are too important. In the paper on the bestowal sons, they point out that there's hardly a vocation we can think of an honorable nature, that some paradise bestowal son hasn't made his living that way on some bestowal world. There's nothing. Jesus happened to be a carpenter because Joseph was a carpenter. This was logical. I don't think God's will relates to vocation, so long as that vocation is characterized by fairness, as we might regard the word. If that vocation is inimical to other persons, I would question that vocation. But as we use the word, generally speaking, the word vocation, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief, I don't think God cares how we spend our days. These are the beads that happen to be in front of us. I've often wondered what I would have been 200 years ago in England. I strongly suspect an Anglican clergyman. That would come the nearest to fitting the kind of life I'm interested in. I don't think God cares that I'm not a clergyman. I don't think Jesus cared that Matthew had been a tax collector. It bothered some of the others, but I don't think it bothered Jesus. I think God is concerned with the de-animalizing of the human critter, the continuous of the growth of the human being. In my personal observation of people, I find that growth is quite involuntary up to about age 25. The last 5 years are maybe dying momentum. You're growing physically. The cortex is growing. Young animals are adventurous. They're puppyish. They're coltish. They kick up their heels and kick over the traces. And Don and Fonda were pretty well scarred up by the time they bore their first offspring. Now, in my observation, growth seems to be optional, starting at about age 25. And in my very sad observation of my fellow men, not too many take up the option. A very great psychologist by the name of William Sheldon, in Psychology and the Promethean Will, speaks of this as the dying back of the forebrain. Men settle down into grooves. They think in cliches. They become increasingly parochial, provincial. They don't make this magnificent escape from time, which is the fruit of maturity. What Rodin talks about when he talks about subordinating the present pleasure for the greater lure of the grander goal. Rodin of Alexandria. The Greek philosopher, yes. Yes.
We'll talk about him later, too, please.
And it's God's will that men continue to grow. God starts man out with an impetus of growth. Ever seen a kid grow at about 13 or 14? It's just plumb involuntary. You can almost see him expand, you know. And consider
So
the...
it's bad, you can't just one foot out of the way of the other.
That's right. And think of that food they shovel away. My children used to bathe in milk, you know. I remember when my milk bill got to be bigger than my rent was originally. This was quite a milestone. God's purpose in relation to man, I think, is pleasure. I'm using that word pleasure in the highest sense of the word. God is doing what he's doing because he enjoys it. I think it's the divine counselor in the first 5 papers that says you can argue all about the universe that you want, but in the last analysis it exists for the pleasure of God. It pleasures God to love. I often think of how infinitely...
It pleases God to be loved.
Yes, that's the corollary. I often think of how infinitely lonesome the Father would be, were it not for his 2 coordinates. There are 2 beings who really understand God because they have infinite capacity, and they're the only 2. God is looking for sons. The pattern of all creation was set when the first being apart from God became his son, and when they expressed themselves in a 3rd being to complete the society of infinity. And ever since, they have been enriching the universe with a sub-infinite, sub-absolute society, starting with the 7 master spirits, if you please. God is looking for partners, sons whom he will take into partnership. The name of such a partnership is a finaliter. Otherwise, it might be described as God and Son Incorporated. It's perfectly obvious who is the senior partner. And for this reason, God invests this creature with a fragment of himself which is automatically subordinated to that creature by virtue of being less than a personality, a pre-personal entity. And there is the quid pro quo. I think each of us has to find God's will in our own Pilgrim's Progress. I do not think that God's will can be revealed by any person to any other person. Jesus could reveal the Father, but each of the 12 took from the life of Jesus what he was uniquely equipped to appropriate. And several times in part 4, you'll recall, they take inventory of the reaction of the apostles. And except for the twins, who were pretty standard, each saw something different, even in his parables. Yes, Wilma?
Jesus taught the will of God.
He lived the will of God.
He taught it.
Yes,
Not
But-
only did he live it, but he taught it.
he never laid down procedure. He laid down
So
principles.
He told them what the will of God was.
Yes. I can tell you what the will of God means to me. It means I should try to live this life richly. I should attempt to get from this life all that I can receive. I should attempt to give to this life all that I can give. And this is how I use the word richly. I don't think I should wrap my opportunities in a cloth and bury them in the ground of neglect. I think I shall be held accountable for my talents someday. I've talked to lazy men with high IQs, and I've drawn an analogy from the parable of the talents. I'm going to say someday you're going to check in at some cosmic Ellis Island. You're a new immigrant. And for all I know, the immigration inspector is a guy by the name of Peter. It's quite besides the point. Maybe he is. I said, I think they're going to ask you some questions up there. And drawing an analogy from Jesus' comments about wealth, I think they're going to ask you, how smart were you? And I said, I'll tell you. I'll give you the answer. Your IQ is 145, give or take 5 points. Then they're going to ask you, what did you do with your brains? And if you wrapped them in a napkin of selfishness and buried them in the soil of indolence, I think you're going to have an awful red face up there.
Wonderful illustration.
Yes, J.B.
God is not a respecter of persons.
No.
He endowed us with all the tools for our salvation and life. I think all he asks us to do is to use those tools wisely on the intellectual level of which we're operating.
Mm-hmm. And lovingly.
That's right.
Yes.
God don't give us any bigger task than we can endure.
No.
He knows our capacity.
If we break down, it's because of self-imposed
That's
tasks.
right.
We might bite off more than we can chew. God never asks us to.
Well, we'll see our mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an experience.
This is good. We learn. I think God wants us to live completely, fully, ethically, morally, adventuresomely, courageously, kindly. I see in God the kindest being in the whole universe. I see in God a quality which I could best describe by coining the word unsoft. In counseling business executives, I've learned to make a sharp distinction between softness and kindness. Softness is cruelty in disguise. Kindness does not shrink from pain if pain is essential to growth. The pediatrician who looks at the infant does not hesitate when he takes a sharp needle, fills his hypodermic, and administers a vaccine to that child, and upsets that child, puts it in a tantrum perhaps, makes it ill for a day because of this foreign substance. And God is wiser than a pediatrician. I think it's God's will that I do my own homework. But I think it's my privilege as a son to ask him for help whenever I honestly feel that the lesson is important and I can't work out the answer. But but I would be ashamed to ask for help until I'd covered many pages with calculations. I think it's God's will also that I carefully refrain from being in any way critical of my fellow men who ask for help before they start their homework. Because I think God is interested in hearing from his children at all times. Criticism of prayer is very stupid criticism, because unwise praying is much better than no praying.
Of prayer.
Mm-hmm. I think God is looking for partners. I visualize the relationship, the ultimate relationship of man to God as a partnership.
Well, a partnership has a joint responsibility to all liabilities unless it's a limited partnership.
No. You have a senior partner and a junior partner in each of these partnerships. I know who the junior partner is. It's going to be me if I make it, see. But this is great. This is great. To be a volitional participant in God's plans. Not to be a Frandalake or a mechanical controller. I'd feel sorry for those beings, except I guess they don't know any better. But to be a creative participant in the unfolding of God's plans. Listen, if God does not need creativity, he knows how to construct Frandalakes, physical controllers, non-volitional, intelligent pieces of exquisitely perfect living machinery. He built paradise, the absolute machine. We only built one like it. He's got a plan which calls for creative partners, beings who can go out into God knows where from here and react creatively, originally, uniquely to the challenge of new situations. He couldn't send a UNIVAC out here to Nebadon to build a universe. He sent Michael, who's his partner on the creative, on the creator level. We'll be in partnership with him on the creature level, but remember, creatures also are creative. We don't bring new beings into existence, save perhaps once, but we're creative in our reaction, in our responses to the challenges of situations, or we may be creative. If we have personalities, we are potentially creative. Where does new music come from? Where does a painting come from? Where does new architecture come from? But the alchemy of human thinking. A UNIVAC can be logical, but a UNIVAC will never be creative in the unpredictable sense.
In using the word creative, you are using it in an entirely different sense than some of the philosophers use the word creative when they speak of the creative mind.
I'm using it as in that sense. In other words, it is the developing of a new conclusion out of old facts, a new response to a familiar challenge, a new interpretation of an arrangement of facts.
That's what we get sometimes, and they're not always right. But they're not always right.
I would say that Bill is creative when he's postulating on outer space.
I'm more extrapolating, Wilma.
What?
Extrapolating, which is, well, it simply says that you take 1, 2, and 3 in an ascending scale, and you measure the rise, and you carry the curve on up. That's extrapolating.
Oh, I see what you're doing.
Amen.
You extend his purpose.
Yeah. I think the will of God to each man is unique, alive, refreshingly original, as personal as a tailored suit. I've looked for symbols which I can think with. And my symbols have got to be pretty simple or I can't feel them. I have symbolized this to myself, for me, as this. Try to live constructively. The term do good has been a bit abused. The expression do-gooder is one that I recoil from because it implies a busybody. You know, I should investigate JB's diet and get him on sunflower seeds or something like that. You know,
Well, they're good for you.
I'm sure they are, but he might be allergic to them. And anyway, that's a heck of an invasion of a guy's privacy. I prefer the word constructive. In life's recurring situations, as you remember, I say to myself, Willie, try to be constructive. And this can put a lot of fun into life, because in a gingerly, reasonably humble way, and my humility grows with age. I was a lot cockier about some of these things 20 years ago. I'd have given you some real answers when I was 25. See what you can do. I recall a wait between planes in Pittsburgh. As a matter of fact, I got fried completing the experiment. I was there with an associate. And there's a square bar in the Pittsburgh airport. And this was, well, the sun had crossed the yardarm, but barely. And we had about 2 hours to kill. And the bartender's relief hadn't shown up. And this fellow was on the verge of an accident. You could just tell how mad he was. He was banging bottles and so on and so forth, and we sat there for quite a length of time. It's a good thing we weren't fresh from the Sahara. We'd have died of thirst in the presence of plenty. Finally, he came over and growled at him, "What do you want?" You know. Well, on a very low, let's not have an explosion. Nice dry Gibson. All right. So my sidekick says, "What do you suppose could be done with this guy?" I said, "I don't know, let's try, just for kicks." So we got served eventually, and considerable got spilled on the counter when he banged the glasses down. And we sipped away, and it was a fair to middling Gibson, which is a lot better than a bad one. And as he came by, I motioned to him. He came over with a scowl on his face. "What do you want?" He sipped away, and it was a fair to middling Gibson, which is a lot better than a bad one. And as he came by, I motioned to him. He came over with a scowl on his face. "What do you want?" I said, "Gee," I said, "that's a real good Gibson. Thanks." "Oh." So we ordered another round. See, it took time to do this, which was our undoing. But I think one should sacrifice oneself now and then in helping one's fellow men, don't you, JB?
I sure do.
We darn near missed our plane. So we complimented him again. And he began to warm up. And then he ran out of $1 bills. And there was no one there to get him. And he really cussed up a storm. Well, I hadn't been on the road too long, and I usually carry a wad of them. And I beckoned him over, and I said, I believe I could loan you some ones. Well, you can have 20, would you? I said, I believe I do. He counted them out. Well, by the time we were fading out of the picture, this guy was real happy.
You were too.
Well, of course, that was chemical, Wilma. But now, we did this as a cold-blooded experiment in trying to get a human being out of an accident-prone state of mind. I take no spiritual credit for that experiment. It was an intellectual adventure. And it was cold-blooded just to see if it could be done. But we left that guy in a good frame of mind. He was grinning when he'd bring us our refreshments and asking us if the sarsaparilla was cold enough.
Well, you knew it could be done.
You sure it wasn't?
Well, it probably could be done, George, yes. The odds are you can do that if you try. Yes.
You was working the game. You
Yeah.
was playing the game.
I was playing a game. But many times I do this with great sincerity. And not with a detached feeling that I'm experimenting. See, this was an experiment, and I cite it. You got a human being who's in trouble. Can you help them? There's a guy who needs a leg up, who's deserving, and you can afford to give him that leg up. Give it to him.
Still out working in an office, still working in your human relationship,
Mhm.
anywhere, working in your home.
Work anywhere.
I read a story about a rabbi down in Houston who is so tender-hearted that if he...
What time was you when you all went to school?
25:36.
When he'd take his paycheck home from the synagogue, if he'd meet a poor man, he'd give him his paycheck. Well, they all loved him. And they take up another collection and kind of bail the family out. So they've adjusted it now. They give his wife his paycheck, and she gives him pocket money. I don't think this man is wise. I don't think he's wise. Consider how complicated the will of God gets when Jesus really talked to the Roman senator about wealth. Now there he gave him detailed principles, approximating a formula. And I want to tell you something. It would take a Philadelphia lawyer and a certified public accountant to put it into effect accurately. You know what I mean? Unless you followed the one piece of advice Jesus gave. In case of doubt, the Father in heaven won't condemn you if you should err somewhat on the side of mercy. Take that example when the senator said, "What would you do with wealth?"
You're on the right instead of the left.
Yes. In case of doubt, remember that fundamental morality is not sex. Fundamental morality is the contest between selfishness and altruism. That's basic morality.
Thank you for saying that, Bill.
And the adjuster is concerned with the normal growth of the human ego, because a prideless man is a pitiable object. But knowing that the ego is pretty strong, the adjuster always leans just slightly on the side of altruism. This to me is what I mean by the word constructive. The word constructive in my practical life is a very big word. I think of it often. Can you be constructive in this situation? Ethics, remember, is a spider web of relationships. I tell a business executive, if you are more than fair to one man in your group, you are automatically less than fair to every other person in that group. It's not just simple, we'll keep old Joe on the payroll. Old Joe may be running a department and may be stultifying and warping everybody in that department. It's a real problem what to do with old Joe. Because old Joe is always inefficient, ineffective, and has been with the company for 25 years and is 57 years of age and has a wonderful wife and is loyal. You know? You don't fire old Joe, but it doesn't mean that you have to keep him in charge of that department and hurt those other people. You cannot follow God's will unless you have a moral foundation. Morality is not spiritual, but it is super animal. If you are moral and you live in a community and you're not a hermit, then you are beholden to ethics, to fairness, to that amalgam of justice and mercy, the hard and the warm, which we would call fairness, that adaptation of mathematical, cold, mechanical justice to the exigencies of the situation, the tempering of the wind of the shorn lamb. This is not a contravention of justice. This is an intelligent, creative adaptation of justice. If you are moral, if you are ethical, then you've got the foundation on which to essay to be spiritual. If you are sincere, and if you have courage, you have the basic equipment to go in search of God's will. If you are not sincere, you have no foundation whatsoever. If you are sincere, which means you are reasonably honest of heart. Not completely, who is?
That's quite a definition. Sincerity.
You're reasonably honest of heart. You are willing to correct a mistake. Then, if you have courage, you will go in motion. The papers say decision. I would substitute the word courage. A courageous man makes decisions. A sincere person could be stationary. A courageous person is voyaging. If he is sincere and if he is in motion, then I care not what his direction is, even if it is completely wrong. He has the velocity and the sincerity to correct his direction and to turn around and go in the right direction. When the woman came in off the street and washed Jesus' feet with her hair, he was talking to a lot of nice guys that were not in motion. And this gal, I don't care how long she'd sailed in the wrong direction, she was moving. And she had just done a 180-degree turn. And from God's perspective, position means nothing. It is direction of movement. Because position is a temporal fact, which has no meaning in eternity if you are moving paradiseward. God could compute only two types of beings: those who are not moving paradiseward, and those who have already arrived because they're in motion. This woman had started to search for God, and from God's perspective, she'd already found him, because God does not think in time. Direction of motion is all that counts in God's viewpoint. Sure, the Pharisees, the Sadducees that were there, if any, I doubt, they may have been much more moral and much more ethical, but they were static. They weren't going anywhere.
That is the same as Jesus criticized them this morning.
Yes, yes. The stupidest, most misbegotten failure on earth. If he starts for God, just who's big enough to stop him? No one. neither powers or principalities.
Still, I have had contact for a couple of years with the minister down here on Reno Street, where I was on his mission. And he constantly amazes me when I talk to him about the derelicts down there, that he's looking after those that turn aside. They're hungry. Not physically, but spiritually. Many of those people are hungry.
The whole damned human race is hungry spiritually in these days.
I just think that those ministers down there that run those missions, they look after them physically too, you know. They feed them. They get them cots to sleep on. They beg clothes for them. I think they do more good than some of these great big church ministers. So we'll stand down there and look at them.
If you think now, if you theologize, then I think wisdom is pretty important. From a temporal standpoint, wisdom is the pearl of great price. Wisdom is the highest value in terms of a temporal life because it includes worship. Otherwise, it's not real wisdom. It's cleverness, it's experience, knowledge. It's pre-wisdom in some form. One of my partners has a lad in college, and this junior and some of his friends were commiserating about the sad state of the world. And the kids are pretty blue, pretty much inclined to charge things off. And Floyd says, "What's wrong with them, Willie?" I said, "Floyd, they're lacking two horizon lines, temporal and religious. They do not know when they are. They have no knowledge of history. And they don't realize that times are not tough now, they just happen to be living now. Times have always been tough." I said, "You talk about atomic fallout, how about the Black Death? It carried away whole populations, whole countrysides were deserted. You talk about hard-boiled warfare, how about the religious wars? They fought over some of those German dairy farms so many times that people just got up and moved away. Square miles were deserted in Germany. Times have always been tough. Hitler was not the first one to execute populations. The Assyrians invented this little trick and moving whole peoples. We're missing several tribes in Israel that got lost somewhere in the shuffle over there because of the Assyrians. And I said the second horizon line they don't have, they have no religion. They don't realize that it's not too awfully important in the light of eternity whether we live out the next 24 hours or not. If you know how tough it's been here on earth, then you can be stoical, which is a fairly high-class materialistic philosophy. And then, if you have religion, then you've got something that's much better than stoicism. When I read history, and I read a lot of it, and I think about the atom bomb, I just shrug my shoulders and I say, "C'est la vie." I mean, this is the way it's always been. We just speeded up things, that's all. When the Mongols got through with the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, it's been a desert ever since, and it was once the garden spot of the world. They wrecked the irrigation canals that had been there since the days of Sumer and Akkad and Ur. And that was only 1300 odd AD. This to me is where one can obtain intellectual peace of mind. Most of us do not know when we are or where we are. We don't know our geography. We don't know our history. I remember listening in the late 1930s in Chicago to the statement, "Who wants to die for dear old Danzig?" And I shuddered because the speaker knew not where Danzig was, what it was, why it was, and I made a mental bet that soon we would be dying for dear old Danzig, and soon we were. In the Old Testament says, above all things get wisdom. Seek wisdom and she will exalt you. This to me means learning where I am and when I am here on earth as a member of the human race in the perilous times of the mid-20th century. But then there have been the perilous times of Attila, the perilous times of Genghis Khan, the perilous times when Sennacherib came down on Jerusalem. There have been the perilous times when Nebuchadnezzar moved in. There have always been perilous times. I just happen to be living now, that's all. That's my conclusion. So, I look around and I don't think these times are so perilous. They're normal. And I don't have to be a blind Pollyanna to take that attitude. And then again, I have a more distant perspective. I really mean this. Whether I live a day, or a year, or decades, to me, as a personality, is not really important. I should like to do some work here. I have some ideas. I've got some things I'd like to write. I have no desire to move on. But I have absolutely no concern about the lifespan that remains to me. This will be determined by circumstances largely beyond my control. I feel like a sower who went forth to sow. And quite obviously, the sower in the parable of fame was neither a geologist nor an agronomist. He didn't know much about soil, or he wouldn't have deliberately sowed seed on barren rock, nor on shallow ground. Obviously, this terrain was an unfamiliar terrain to him. He didn't waste his seed, albeit the seed being free, he could afford to be prodigal with it. The seed of truth is free. We don't have to husband it. And we each live our lives, I think, like that sower. We do the best job of sowing that we can do, and then recognize that the harvest will be largely determined by circumstances beyond our control. And this, to me, is a philosophic attitude toward life, which has nothing to do with complacency, because one should diligently sow. But only a fool would expect the harvest to be 100-fold in all areas. Only a fool.
But you still
Well, of course you do. Because the seed happens to be free.
There are several aspects of God that is free. Mercy.
Mm-hmm. I find in the construction of a personal philosophy of life, I find three concepts to be very practical and helpful. My philosophy, I symbolize it in my mind like a castle. Its outer works, fairly vulnerable. The outer works are founded in Epicureanism, not hedonism. Hedonism is the pursuit of pleasure. Epicureanism is the intelligent enjoyment of life. I don't think my taste buds were put here to be frustrated. But if I eat too much, I get fat. I should exercise some restraint here. But I don't feel sinful about thick, juicy steaks, or about a pleasant place to sleep or air conditioning. I feel so sorry about the Hindus who worship cows instead of eating the critters. I mean, they're really missing a choice morsel here. I enjoy life. I don't frustrate my senses within the bounds of morality and ethics, and an attempt to live constructively. I think it's here to be enjoyed. I get some pretty stout walls. My walls are founded in Stoicism because I think there's a lot of things that happen. I think I should be able to cope with these things. I mean, the good Lord didn't give me courage and fortitude to no purpose. I don't think I should go running to God every time I cut my finger, you know? And Stoicism is heroic self-respect. You do these things because you're the kind of person that does these things. One of the greatest Stoic statements I've ever read is on a tombstone in the environs of Rome. Evidently, an old Roman sea captain lies buried there. And here's what's inscribed on his tombstone. O Father Neptune, may this ship come safely to port. But whether it so be your will or be not your will, I hold this rudder true. Paul had a lot of stoicism in his makeup. Stoicism is concatenated guts, organized courage. And I think there's a great place for it in life. But my inner keep this goes down to bedrock. I have unshakable confidence in God. This, I think, is impregnable. Now, I feel sorry for people who have just an inner keep, you know. The walls are pretty thick. I don't know that it's fun to live there all the time, just living with unshakable confidence in God. I think it could destroy a lot of a human being's freshness and utility in the world. This is my castle. It's got three defenses. I've often lost the outer works. One or twice I've had the wall pierced, but I can always get back and mend the wall, see, because I can always sally from the inner bastion. I trust God completely.
This is where the whole strength is the other two walls emanate.
Oh, yes, sure. I could argue from God, but I can't argue about Him. I could discuss Him. But as concerns His reality, and His dependability, and His love, we might talk about how better to put those words, but not those principles. To take a Greek prefix and use it a little differently, they're meta-debatable. And that's after all argument, or beyond all argument. Now, as to what God's apt to do here and now, gee whiz, we can speculate from here until hell freezes over, with some mutual edification.
This seems to me to be a rather logical thought.
you're gonna run over there.
Well, you know,
We want to go home and get some old slacks and a shirt on.
but you know, we didn't explain what God's will was, did we?
No, but we sure talked about
We
it.
nibbled all around the subject, but we never got into it, did we?
That depends upon what you call getting into God's will. If you say A, B, C, this is it.
Mhm.
No, we never did.
No, we can't, I don't think.
I don't think so either.
I don't
There
think
is-
that's doable.
2 or 3 questions that arose in my mind, and but I'll be damned if I wanted to interrupt.
George, look, I think God's will is much bigger than we dream. It's much roomier than we dream. I think within the framework of God's will, there is an infinite arena for the expression of all that is legitimate in human will. But not for very much that's not legitimate. But for all of the legitimate aspirations, desires, hopes, yearnings of human will. In eternity, heck yes. I don't think, you see, men are wound up for more than one short life.
That's what you don't realize about that.
Of course not. Of course not. If you're only wound up for one lifetime, you'd run down on the first mentioned world. You're wound up for eternity. And within the framework of God's will, I think there is an infinite play for all that is legitimate and honorable and fair in human will. In fact, I think man will be encouraged. One of the great statements in these papers concerning the consecration of human will says, when man gives God all that he has, then God makes that man more than he is. It's in the Supreme Being paper. I think it's in the paper on God the Supreme.
You have all kinds of references on the will, I'll bet you. Huh? Sweetie.
Page 1285.
I was within one page of it, sir. I was on 87. Yes, paragraph 3. When man consecrates his will to the doing of the Father's will, when man gives God all that he has, then does God make that man more than he is.
George, I think it's Christ. I gave you all the references I had on God's will. Didn't I? Didn't we give those out there one night? But
Not to me.
Oh, what's Sunday night? What's Sunday night?
well, was it? I was thinking this week ago last Wednesday night. But it's Sunday night too. We were talking about it, weren't we? That's all true.
We were talking about it, and we made some references. But I didn't have,
1431 and
1285.
No, to me, each of us is like Simon Peter, to whom Jesus said, in essence, Peter, I've got a big investment in you. Pay out, please. Or in more familiar words, be a good shepherd, feed my sheep. God's made quite an investment in each human being. Be he Peter or the Alpheus twins. And I think it's God's will that the investment pay out. God's will is like a command to a musician. Write beautiful music. But then God says nothing more and leaves it up to that musician as to the selection of his melodies.
And I turned out a hillbilly rockin' hymn.
Well, that's nothing. That's progress, George.
Got recorded. I'm glad you came too, because you asked me.
You can't explain God's will, but you can sure feel it. With differing degrees of wisdom. You can't explain God's love, but you can get the impact of it. Mhm.
Well, I think we've won it all. That's our place to ask.
Seeing you again.
Now you folks can ask him something.
We'll keep him busy, George. You can rest assured.
I wish I knew what God's will was for sure. But then, you know something, George, all the adventure would go out of it. It's God's will that we adventure, this I'm sure of.
That's gonna be fun. See you tomorrow evening.
Oh, fine.
Pleasant evening, George.
Thank you. Oh, I shall have a great time reading news and stuff like that. Have a ball.
Okay.
You all have nothing to do between 11 and 12. Listen to KTOK. Work hard.
You going to be on, George? George pinch hits for the forum on Saturday night.
What work did you do this week? What did George do?
Well, he has something to do with KTOK, but he pinch hits for him and he does a little of everything. I don't know his official capacity.
11 or 12 tonight, I have my dispute with the person. When I mentioned Rodin how ago, this thought has come to me many times, and I never thought to bring it up. Without a doubt, the writers of these papers, I shouldn't say without a doubt, I mean, what do you think? The writers of these papers felt that Rodin was the most outstanding of all of the exponents of the teaching system.
He was probably the best Greek philosopher at that time. He had an explosion. He'd been exposed to Jesus' teaching.
Yeah.
He had been.
Well, Texas
Yes.
University has come down.
Yes, the evangelist had gotten down to Alexandria. And I think they felt this was the pinnacle of Greek philosophy with a Jesusonian tinge to it.
What about what age was Jesus at the time that Rodin?
32, 33, getting near the end of his career.
In other words, Rodin was just right for these teachings,
Yeah.
and he just expanded to hurry.
Yeah. And this was
This is a pretty deep land, too.
this was Greek philosophical thought at its best. Greek philosophical thought with a religious factor in it, which was absent from most of Greek philosophy.
As I was going to say, most of the Greeks were not.
Mm-hmm. Now remember this too. All of Rodin was not this good. This is a synopsis of a week's talk, edited by the Midwares,
Oh,
and they picked. This is the best of Rodin. And if you would
so
take,
he put out these little jewels for us.
and if you would take all of the tapes I've ever made down here and get some midwares to edit them, it could sound real good, you know what I mean?
I wonder what would happen if they edited your tape. They'd be hardly able to pull anything out there.
They sure would. They'd know where I was wrong, and they'd just leave that part out. No, this is the best of Rodin. The three of them didn't talk at that intellectual pitch for a whole week, because you haven't got a week's discourse in here.
One evening's discourse was.
But they've taken the gems that came out that week and have put them together. And it's great stuff. It's so practical. You want to make money? Don't pray. And don't think the life of service will give it to you either. Go pitch a tent alongside a stream where money flows. And this is the way you'll make money. I could spend a life devoted to, hillbillies. And I'm sure that I could live a much more Christian life and a finer life and be broke all my life. I happen to work for corporations. I've pitched a tent alongside a stream where money flows.
Well, you haven't made that exclusively
No.
your life, though.
Mm-mm. I have.
Because if you had, you'd be sitting here this afternoon.
Quite right, Wilma. Quite right. But it's interesting work, and you can do some good there, too.
Intolerance of racial, of race, might have something to do with that, you know. It might have been an intolerance of Jews in the city. They'd rather buy,
Gee, this was fun this afternoon.
We had this question come up out at Cal Lesson Home the other day at the board meeting. Somebody on the radio here called up and wanted to promote, mention the hospital out there and promote the idea of people turning in their trading stands, sending them out there, which could be used for buying certain things that the hospital might use, maybe something for the children and so forth. And so they said that they didn't believe they do it right now because some Catholic organization was asking for, over radio or TV, was asking for fans to buy a school bus. You know, one school did that.
You can get a school bus with green stands.
And yes, they
Really?
did. Yes, and
Take quite a
other
swatch
schools
of them,
doing it.
probably.
And so the hospital decided, the board decided that they would not do that at this time until this other drive is over. And I said to the girl sitting next to me, who happened to be Nell Borden, I said, well, you know what, they don't know, but you can't say a darn thing about it, because I'm sure a lot of those volunteers out there, or some of them might be gathered. The thing of it is now that there's a lot of people who wouldn't send stamps to the Catholics, but they would send. But you couldn't send it.
Working on facts.
Bill, do we have time yet in our afternoon session to allow us to hear your distinction for us between truth and fact? Or would you like to
That's a
start?
long one.
Or would you like to start immediately after dinner?
Right now.
We can cover truth and fact, because I don't know much about it.
Well, I want your good home father down there.
The only facts
Interpretation.
The only facts that we can deal with, which are totally factual, are arithmetical concepts.
What?
Arithmetical concepts. All other facts are never completely factual because we encounter them in reality. They're never quite totally comparable, and we interpret them. The perfect factual statement is 2 plus 2 equals 4. And as was the case when the school teacher said to little Johnny, that answer is good, he replied, good hell, teacher, it's perfect. Now, when you compare...
It's truth and fact.
No,
I'm just dealing with facts first.
I hope it can be called truth, too.
This is a fact, whether you like it or not.
That one was perfect.
That's perfect. If you get two Chevrolets, to pick a brand at random, they're not exactly the same. They're approximately the same. So our practical experience with facts is valid, even though we are slightly less than factual the minute we leave abstract mathematics. Absolutely pure fact, I think we know in mathematics. When we say that water freezes or boils at thus and such a degree centigrade, this is only an approximate fact. Air pressure, altitude, purity of the water, all of these introduce minor traces that adulterate the purity of that fact. Nevertheless, this is a practical fact. You follow me?
Mm-hmm.
We can use the word practically in saying water boils at 100 degrees centigrade and freezes at 0. Now, facts are inconcussible, which means you can't do anything about them. They're rigid. 2 plus 2 equals 4. You can throw a temper tantrum. You can get down. You can throw your oatmeal on the floor. And it has nothing to do with its fact. See, there it stands, see. That's what the word...
Get hot.
You can, yeah, that's what the word inconcussible means to me. It's in the papers here. It's why I use that 4-bit word. It's absolutely rigid. Take it or leave it. God is spirit, but paradise is not. That's a flat fact. Truth, on the other hand, is amorphic, which means ever-changing in form, the opposite of rigid. Truth is living. Facts are frozen. I don't want to call them dead, but they're static. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is there, it's been there, it will be there. Even God can't alter that mathematical fact. But they're static. 2 plus 2 equals 4 is there, it's been there, it will be there. Even God can't alter that mathematical fact. They stopped with 7 master spirits. They ran out of possibilities. That's right. You can't go any further. Which it makes 7 very sensible when you think about it. Truth varies. Truth has got elements of goodness in it, which facts have nothing to do with. Facts are neither good nor evil, they just are. Or as one German philosopher put it, jenseits von Böse und Gut, beyond all good and evil. 2 plus 2 equals 4. To call that good or evil is ridiculous, isn't it? It's like discussing, do you want razor blades or shoes for dinner tonight? See? It's out of context. Does that make sense?
Sure does.
The word good or evil has no application to mathematics. It just is. It's factual. Now, truth, real truth must be good. It cannot be true without being good. And complete truth is also beautiful. It is attractive. Truth is living. Facts are frozen. Let me give you an illustration. I've used this in a talk on this subject. Now, let me tell you a couple of fables here. And let's not make him go on all fours. But I'm over-dramatizing the difference between truth and fact. I've got to over-dramatize it to get it through. I searched for an illustration of fact without truth. And what I'm really saying is relative facts with virtually no truth. Because I can't get them in their absolutely pure state, see? But practically speaking, this is fact without truth. A well-informed but very unwise parent clobbers little Oswald, age 7, with the whole, complete, detailed, gory story of the birds and the bees. Nothing left out, absolutely nothing. And this is a shock to this child and scars that child. And let's say that that story is exquisitely factual, detailedly factual, with pictures. And the child recoils, and the child is severely hurt by that story. This is a bad experience for that child. I say there was no truth in those facts at that time to that child. This was not good, neither was it beautiful. I tried to conjure up the opposite, truth without fact. And I never did think of a story, but I ran into this little anecdote. And I just chuckled. I said, I've been looking for this for years. A young student of anthropology went on a field expedition with his professor to the island of New Guinea. And up in an upland mountain valley, they spent the whole summer with a tribe living in the Stone Age. Study their mores, customs, their mating practices, their brides' parades, the puberty ceremonies, and whatnot. And left. 8 years later, the young man, by now an assistant professor of anthropology, headed an expedition to the same valley, in the same mountainous area in New Guinea. And the old chief recognized him. And he came up to him and he says, you big man, you're a tribe now. And the professor, after all, he's a professor in a big university, he says, yes. He says, how many wives you have? And the anthropologist unhesitatingly answered, 6. How much cost these women? And again, without hesitation, the anthropologist answered, 10 cows each. You big man, your tribe now. If the anthropologist had given the chief the facts of the case, to which he had one wife who cost him nothing, there would have been no communication whatsoever. The chief simply wouldn't have understood this. But if he had 6 wives and he paid 10 cows apiece, he's a big man in his tribe. The anthropologist communicated. We now have a fair example of truth without any facts at all. Yes, that's right. Now, I've distorted, seriously, but I've got to distort to dramatize the difference. When you're dealing with truth, there's an old expression, meat for men and milk for babes. You must adapt your interpretation of facts to the situation. There was an old darky who used to stand guard outside of the office of the president of Standard Oil. And you didn't go in to see Mr. Subert without clearing through William Oxford. He was an old Pullman car porter, an awfully nice guy. And I have cooled my heels my share of time waiting to get in to see the big boss. And William and I would pass the time of day. And William was talking about a survival party in the Pacific Ocean. And they were just about they're at the end of their resources when a seagull split and they caught the bird. And then it rained. The Almighty looks after his children. Now, to me, those were chance circumstances.
Not for me.
But I wouldn't argue with William for all the tea in China, because we're each entitled to our interpretation of those episodes. And I'm not in the business of attacking faith when I encounter it.
Maybe God didn't, but some of God's children did.
This is true to William. This is not true to me. And I refuse to quarrel. Do you follow me? Truth involves interpretation. Truth involves an adaptation. Jesus gave truth to some of the 12 and admonished them to tell no man. They had the capacity to ask. Nathaniel got the master all by himself. And he said, Master, would you trust me with the truth of the Scriptures? He smelled. He had a keen nose, and he saw that Jesus didn't quote them all. And he suspected, the Old Testament. And Jesus smiled and he said, yes, Nathaniel. Because Nathaniel had the capacity to absorb what Jesus was to tell him. But when he got through, it wouldn't hurt Nathaniel.
But,
let's consider an imaginary conversation. There was a Persian, undoubtedly a Zoroastrian, who arrived at the Pella encampment, Taherma by name. And the 12 talked to him, and he got ready to pack and leave in a huff. They took him to Jesus, and he unpacked. And afterwards, they asked Jesus, they said, how come we struck out and you hit a home run? And Jesus grinned, and he said, you tried to take something away from him, and I tried to give him something. And I tried to reconstruct what might have happened there. And I can just see someone of the more theological minded of the 12, and remember, these are Jewish monotheists who look askance at Zoroastrianism, which apparently is a dualism. You've got Ahura Mazda, the god of light, fighting Ahriman, the lord of darkness. It's not really dualistic in eternity, but on the time level, they fight on equal terms. And they've got fire as a symbol. And I can just imagine one of them saying, now the first thing we've got to get straight on is you've got to quit worshiping fire. And another thing, no one contends with God on equal terms. At which point the Zoroastrian is bristling. And I can imagine Jesus talking to him and using words perhaps like this. Just as fire chases away the shadows of the darkness of evil, so does it also burn away the dross of error from the gold of truth. And this is good semantics talking to a Zoroastrian. Yes.
Bill, that was the thing that was worrying me the other night about this omnipresence discussion we were having. There was George and Mac and another woman that was coming. I believe she come one afternoon we met at Eva Park. I was afraid that we were getting in the position of subtracting.
Do you now see why Jesus used parables?
Yes.
He could handle freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors with parables. You older timers, if you've got a freshman in your group, be a little temperate in your questions. Meat for men and milk for babes is still pretty sound. And there are things which we would talk about and just have a ball with and kick them around. I'd be a little hesitant if we had a lot of freshmen here.
But that's all right, because you showed up and George came to that.
Mm-hmm.
He was the one that was staring down.
go on to the lesson, and we'll take
Yeah.
up the ubiquity when we come to it later in the book. And I figured by the time we got over there, we would have mellowed up a little.
You can't live facts, Wilma, but you can live truth. You can know facts. You can't live them. You can't live the law of gravity, but you can aspire to live the love of God. Yes,
Can anything be good and not be truth?
not in the real sense of the word good, only in the distortions of the human mind. The Greeks, Clyde, the Greeks offer in their philosophy and in their culture much that is beautiful and much that is true. But they suffer from a lack of an equal amount of goodness. The Jews had a tremendous concept of goodness and morality, but they suffered from a lack of beauty and from a lack of philosophy in their religion. Christianity draws on both cultural resources, and that's why it was so appealing to the Roman world. At first, the Romans made the early Jewish Christians get dressed up in Greek togas before they take them seriously. And when the Jewish sect Hellenized itself, then it became acceptable to the Roman world.
That's why truth, goodness, and beauty is tied together each time.
They sure need to be,
But
Wilma.
it could be, you could have something good then from what you said without it being true.
Not in the real sense of the word good, only in the human, distorted, evil, error sense.
Then
This
the
is
Jews,
good- this
then
is-
the Jewish religion was distorted.
Yes, so was the Greek philosophy. The Greeks suffered from a lack of the concept of goodness. The Jews suffered from a terrible lack of beauty and a considerable lack of philosophic truth. The Jews never philosophized very much.
In
The
other
Greek
words, you have none of these if you do not have all three.
In the real sense of the word, they represent error and evil admixed with. You have a lack of symmetry. Something is missing. Something essential is missing. The good must be true and beautiful. The true must be good and beautiful. The beautiful, if it's really beautiful, must be true and good. They're inseparable. They're the comprehensible elements of divinity. When you unite them and experience them, they come out as love, mercy, ministry. God is love. The Son is mercy, love applied. And the Spirit is ministry, mercy in action. Yes.
Relegate this to its correct position, the statement the farmer made, the sun is hot.
That's a factual statement. Relatively factual.
Is that a fact?
That's
or is
a
that
fact.
truth?
That's factual. This isn't necessarily,
It's not in the realm of truth or untruth.
it's not necessarily good or beautiful. It's a statement of fact. The sun may be too hot. This may be bad in the farmer's concept. His land may be parched.
It's in the realm of fact, and it is a relative.
Yes.
I see. Less than pure mathematics is relatively factual.
That's right.
Other than pure mathematics.
Right. Facts deal with things in our practical experience. Truth deals with meanings. Goodness relates to values.
Goodness relates
To values.
Truth relates to
Meanings. Interpretation. The most that a thing can be is beautiful.
Well, it's beautiful, the unification of contrast.
Well, no, you can have beauty in inanimate things. A design may be beautiful. The most that a meaning can be, or an interpretation can be, is true. And the highest value is good. Goodness.
What is a good definition of beauty?
Harmony.
Well, then unification.
Harmonious pattern. Or the beauty of concept.
Beauty is
There's
three types of energies, can it?
Oh yes.
Final, spiritual, and
Yes.
physical.
Oh yes. I think seraphim must be very beautiful. Why wouldn't they be? There's beauty in this book. Beauty of concept, beauty of the use of the English language. I think it's well that the book wore the garments of beauty rather than being written poorly. It's bad enough to read it even when it's beautiful. You know, I don't think you can separate these three things. Here, let's take a blue-nosed Protestant concept. You know what I mean. Here you have a rather sterile abstraction of goodness, an over-accentuation of morality, a restriction of conduct, a concept which is a victim of Protestantism. It protests against so many things, you know. You don't do this, you don't do that, you don't do the other thing, you don't do this, you don't do that. This concept of goodness is very repellent to many, many people. That record of Bill Alexander, where he comments about dancing, you remember? And he heard the sermon that this minister preached on dancing. He says, "Believe me, that man shouldn't dance."
We found one more record. They found one more piece that was recorded now.
That's what I mean. The truth, beauty, and goodness, you see, are mutually corrective. When the Bible says the world is 6,000 years of age, it's talking out of order. The Bible has no concern with the physical origins of this world. That's a subject for an astrophysicist to discuss. And if a physicist says there is no God, he's equally out of order. He's working over in the domain of values. Theologians are not experts on things. And students of things are not experts on values. The physicist, as a physicist, has no opinion about God. He's dealing with the material universe. The theologian, as a theologian, has no opinion about the physical origins of this world. He deals with God and with values. Now, the philosopher can have a Roman holiday because he reaches out for both, see? I think of reality as being kind of like a water molecule. You got divalent oxygen in the middle and a hydrogen atom on either side. And these two hydrogen atoms in this symbolization don't touch. And here's science and here's religion. And in their pure states, neither has anything to say about the other. If religion contains superstitions, science will purge it. Because they won't stand up. But a philosopher, he's the oxygen atom in the middle, and he's got to work out a unified field theory here. He's got to say, well, now wait a minute, we got a law of gravity, and we got a love of God, and this universe has got to be consistent. You can't have two centers in the last analysis, although it's interesting to note you do have two centers in next to the last analysis. You have paradise and the eternal sun. But in the final analysis, there is only the universal Father.
We should all aspire to be good molecules of oxygen.
Yeah,
Shouldn't I?
sure.
I want to be a good molecule of oxygen
That's right.
in a drop of water.
You see, when you come right down to it, science never quarrels with religion on religious issues. It's only when religion presumes to make scientific statements. Then they have an awful hassle. And of course, the physicists are equally foolish. A lot of them are religious. I would think of a conversation I had after a class in physics many years ago. There was in the class a lad who believed in the omnipotence of God. God does everything. And so all you had to do was be a true believer, and you won't bruise your feet, or nothing bad's going to ever happen to you. You know, just pray and worship, and you're going to have it. You got it made. And that's an Egyptian concept that got into the Old Testament. Well, I was belaboring him after class and pointing out all sorts of Herodotus things that happened to the so-called saints, and just trying to point out to him this theory won't stand up very well. And afterwards, why, my professor beckoned to me, old Dr. Lohr. And I stepped in his office, and he said, Sadler, he said, "You're not a mechanist, are you?" I said, "Good heavens, no." "Fine," he said, "I thought you were too intelligent to be a materialist." This is a guy teaching physics. We never pursued the subject, but I've always remembered. Then I had a course in comparative religions. I discovered the instructor didn't even believe in God.
No food.
That's right. University of Chicago, the departments of religion were pretty much secularist, and most of the physicists and chemists believed in God. It was very unusual. Do you have a feeling for fact and truth?
Bill, may I ask a question?
Sure.
I mean, not for everyone, but it's just a good example to give that when Jesus said, "When you have seen me, you have seen the Father," that's a statement of truth, not a fact.
Of course. Of course. The Father was not 6 feet tall and didn't wear a beard. If Jesus was bearded, I suspect he was. The Father is not a magnificent specimen of humanity, which Jesus of Nazareth certainly was.
Well, the average person, thinks of him that way, but I think of him as light. I don't know why.
I do too, Wilma.
Because the universal Father is
Right,
light.
that's not all of it.
My symbol for God is a bit Zoroastrian. Against a field of darkness, and it's astronomical darkness, the night of the night sky, I see increasing brilliance as I get nearer and nearer a focal point. I think that is my present symbol for God.
My reason for thinking that is that we are told that our human eyes cannot even discern, begin to discern, way down the line from the universal Father.
Is God beautiful?
Oh, yes.
He must be.
That would be the most costly, the most beautiful thing that ever in our eyes.
You know, that must be an experience.
When they tell us how beautiful the heavens are, as we go up mansion worlds and all these things, the beauty increasing.
You know, when you go in to paradise from the third Havana circuit, and you go into whatever it is you go into, the central shining, they call it in one place, and you penetrate to the heart of that thing, and you actually recognize God. That's your third trip in there. You know that's going to be a hell of a big experience. And you know,
For millions of years, we're going to be conditioned for that time.
and this is minimum, Wilma. This is just barely. You just barely recognizing. That's probably it.
Barely be from the sun.
You stop and think of these primary supernatum, the angels of perfection, the pattern for all angels, the direct creation of the infinite spirit, and how wise they must be. But they have never yet been able to calculate how much worship is coming out up there. To me, the word worship is synonymous with love in the highest sense of that word. And it's a special word which we use to denote the love which a creature bears for a creator.
Still, I have wondered, you know, they say that we do not know the growth of our own soul. I wonder if we are conscious of how much we love the Lord.
Probably
I
not.
believe that is something that we're not conscious of. I believe that our love grows for the Lord as we seek to do His will.
Well, the more you do for anybody, the more you're apt to love them. That's true on the human level. That's why parents love children more than children could possibly love parents. Parents do more for children, and it's as it should be.
Well, I've seen a few cases where the children do big more for parents.
But by and large, Wilma.
By and large.
By and large.
By and large, you're right.
I want to ask a question.
Those are the best.